Hey everyone, Gordon here. I'm just actually out for a hike in Manning Park. And actually, while we were at Manning Park, we thought we might do a video just on our favorite hikes in Manning. We often get asked that question by folks that we run into, so here's a list of our favorite hikes in Manning Park. Hope you enjoy. Now, a couple things before we get started. This is just our favorite hikes. It's not all the hikes in Manning. You may have some of your own. If you do, please share them below in the comments. The other thing too, Manning Park is a mountainous park, so weather can change. Most of the trails are pretty remote. There is a variety of wildlife, including both black and grizzly bears. We give you the statistics so you can judge whether or not the hike might be for you or not. We use a book, quite a dated version of it, called 103 Hikes in Southwestern BC. That works quite well for us. We often find the information that's in seems fairly accurate for us. It may not be as useful or as accurate for you. We often talk about whether we found the hike easier or hard. That's quite subjective. It'll depend on your experience, your level of fitness. What we find easy, you may find hard, or maybe the other way around. So just be aware of that before you do any of the trips. Also, this isn't a video hiking guide. It's just our favorite hikes. So if you're going to do any of these trips, just be prepared. Make sure you have a hiking guide, some sort of a map, brochure, something from BC Parks that tells you how to do the route, GPS, whatever you need, hiking essentials, before you do any of these hikes. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. All right, well, these are our favorite hikes in Manning Park. The first is Lightning Lakes Trail, and that actually goes around several other lakes. The next is the Three Brothers Trail, then Windy Joe, Skyline East, and Mount Frosty. Now we're going to cover each of these in more detail as we move through the video, and we also have a bonus trip at the end, which actually starts at the outskirts of the park. So hang in there if you're interested. Now the Lightning Lake Trail is likely the easiest here, in part as it's relatively flat, well laid out, and you can easily choose how much time you want to spend, so how hard you want it to be is basically how long you want to go. Also important to us is that you can access it right from the camping at Lightning Lakes Campground, although the Skyview Campground's very close as well. And there's also 2 day parking lots to choose from. Walking around Lightning Lake, you have a few routes to choose. And this can be done as a short trip from the main access points or from the campground. We do this often ourselves if we want a short outing with some wonderful lake views. Now, if you're feeling more adventurous, you can continue along all the lakes: Lightning, Flash, Strike, and finally Thunder. Note that the main trail gets worse, is less well laid out, and at times very bushy the closer you get to Thunder. Few folks ever go that far, I think. Near Thunder is actually the only time we've come across a bear in Manning, and it was in a bushy area where we had quite limited vision. The older version of 103 Hikes has a trip listed as 24 kilometers return if you follow all the lakes, with a minor elevation gain of 30 meters and a high point of 1,250 meters. They suggest you allow 8 hours. You can, as we noted, choose a shorter version of the hike and just spend a few hours if you wish. Just a side note, we've actually paddled all these lakes, including Thunder, in our pack raft. Next on our list is the Three Brothers Trail, which ultimately leads you to Three Brothers Mountain and past, if you will. We generally don't go that far, and we have in the past, but now we usually just get to the base or maybe within a kilometer or so of its base and then return. For us then, it's a relatively easy trail, and we take this trail primarily to see wildflowers. Now you get to drive up to the trailhead on a windy, paved, and then gravel road, so you gain most of the elevation that way. The rest of the trip is relatively flat unless you hike the mountains at the very end. Now once you start, you lose elevation of maybe 150, 160 meters down to a backcountry campground. Then you have to regain that elevation to get back up on the ridge. Now the ridge is often full of wildflowers if in season, which is usually midsummer. Now of course on the way back you lose and then regain the same elevation. Now as I noted, we often stop partway, maybe 2 hours in, and just enjoy the flowers and the amazing views. 103 Hikes has the distance return at 21 kilometers if you hike as far as First Brother Mountain. Elevation gain is about 320 meters. The high point is 2,273 meters. And they recommend allowing up to 7 hours to do the trip. We're actually surprised because we don't see very many people on this trip despite how easy it is to get to. Windy Joe is the first trip that we would actually list as hard, and it's actually hard to find information about it. We think it's harder than the stats suggest in that the first 2 kilometers or so are slightly downhill, and the remaining 5+ kilometers are pretty much uphill, all at a really moderate grade. Now those first 2 kilometers follow a nice path along the Similkameen River, and then you reach a junction that leads to the Pacific Crest Trail and an alternate route up to Mount Frosty if you wish. You may get some wildflowers about 2/3 of the way up, and perhaps some at the top. Views are very limited until you're near the summit, and honestly, this trail just seems longer than it is to us, at least the end, which just seems to take forever. Now the highlight of the trip is the old, no longer in operation forestry lookout at the summit, and despite its age, it's still very well maintained, and from there you get some amazing views of the mountains in the Okanagan to the Cascades in the south. The trip length per All Trails website is 15.6 kilometers return to the main trailhead, with an elevation gain of about 766 meters. Now remember, the first few kilometers are downhill, so the elevation gain is really more like over that little 5 kilometer plus section. High point is just over 1,800 meters. All Trails suggest the average time to complete the trip's 5.5 hours, which I think for many people would be optimistic. We only see a few people on this trip, even though it's well marked at the trailhead. But I would note we don't usually hike on weekends. Skyline East. Some folks may consider this easier than Windy Joe, but for us we have it here as it's longer, especially if you go as far as Lone Goat. This may be our favorite hike at the right time of year, sort of midsummer. Unfortunately, it begins several kilometers past the Lightning Lake Campground at Strawberry Flats. It's not a long drive, but it's not really accessible from the campground unless you want to add a fair amount of distance to the trip. Now there's an alternate hike that we'll mention as well in a minute. Once at the trailhead, you walk along a flat trail that eventually leads uphill and into the forest. At about 6 kilometers, you reach an area called Despair Pass with some amazing views. Now here you follow the trail downward, losing some elevation, and you'll regain it quickly as you carry on up to a ridge that's just again beautiful in midsummer. The first summit is called Snow Camp, and it makes a worthwhile destination just by itself. If you go to the summit and then continue on, you lose a bit of elevation and you need to regain it to reach Lone Goat at around 10 kilometers. Both have stunning views, more so to the south and to the west. 103 Hikes actually has the round trip at 20 kilometers, an elevation gain of 665 meters, a high point of 2,005 meters, and they suggest allowing 7 hours for this trip. Now as an alternative, there's a trip from Lightning Lake Campground that covers similar terrain. It takes a different route and eventually gets to Despair Pass as well, or you can get close enough that you get some nice views. If we do this trip, we rarely go as far as Despair Pass. We usually get up just to the top of the ridge, enjoy the views, and turn around and go back to the campground. Mount Frosty is probably our second favorite trip, but it's hard, and especially if you do the whole trip to the summit. It's approximately 22 kilometers return with 1,160 meters of elevation gain, and it's got a long, steep section near the end. Well, actually, some folks would probably call it a slog. Its high point is 2,410 meters. 103 Hikes actually suggest taking 8 hours on this trip, but we know several folks who take quite a bit longer. You can access this from the main day parking lot at Lightning Lakes, and you can also go from the Lightning Lake or Skyview campground, but leaving from the campground adds approximately 1 kilometer more each way. Much of the hike's through forests, sometimes with a few nice views and occasional wildflowers in midsummer. The grade is moderate, and there's a few flat areas and 2 meadows. When you actually get into the upper meadow, you'll find an area that has generally some nice flowers and some beautiful alpine larch trees. Now, alpine larch trees only grow above 1,800 meters, and in the fall turn a wonderful gold color. As you move through the meadow, it becomes steeper and more open until you come to a steep rocky trail leading up to this ridge. Once on the ridge, you continue your ascent to the summit at 2,410 meters. There's also an alternate route down that hooks up to the Windy Joe Trail, but that can add a fair amount of distance and time. We don't do that route anymore. By the time you get to the summit, it's a bit of a rocky finish, but there's some wonderful views from the top. The actual U.S. border is just a little bit to the south, and really it seems like you can see forever in every direction here. But note, you're also high up, so weather can change quickly, and actually surprisingly it can be quite buggy. Last on our list is Mount Outram, or some people refer to it as Outram. Technically, only the start of the trail is actually in the park, and most of it falls outside. It's definitely the hardest for us. It's not the longest at 18 kilometers return, but it's got the most elevation gain at 1,800 meters. And it's almost a constant uphill most of the way with only a few flat sections. And the end, well, the end really is a slog. The high point here is 2,460 meters. Now the trailhead's actually at Manning Park West Gate. Yes, that's where the giant marmot is. So if you're camping in Manning, it's a bit of a drive. The trail starts off on an old engineering road and then soon branches off into the forest where you leave the park, and it soon becomes quite steep. Eventually it opens up on a hillside and you'll see some wonderful wildflowers again, right time of year. And then you'll come to a small alpine lake. After this, the trail becomes much rougher and steeper. Again, a very long slog, and it's often very hard to follow the route because there's only a few paint splashes on some rocks and the odd cairn to guide you to the summit above. Again, it feels much longer than it is, especially as you work your way up through the rough rocks. The actual summit is just over 2,460 meters. Most people stop on, I guess, what we call a fall summit, which is much less difficult and largely the same elevation. At least that's what we do. Again, some wonderful views, notably to the south as you hike. And this hike actually seems to be popular despite its challenges, and we've often seen quite a few other people there. Some camp as well at the small lake that's en route. 103 hikes suggest you allow 9 hours, and I think that would be optimistic. I know many people that take a couple hours more. All right, well, where I am now, it's about to rain, so best to close off this video. Hope you enjoyed seeing our favorite trails in Manning Park. Please let us know in the comments below your favorite trails. Please give us a thumbs up if you have enjoyed the video, and if you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing. And Mickey, Finch, and I will see you next time.